السلام عليكم. يديرين بخير؟ نتمنى تكونوا بخير وعلى خير. This is a new question, okay, in conversation. إذا هذا السؤال هذا في ال conversation غنستعملوه في ال communications or conversations. Why don't you? Why don't you? Okay. إذا why don't you؟ إذا هذا suggest. How to suggest. اوكي كيفاش تقترح. اذا اقتراح هذا suggestion. اوكي اذا السؤال اللي خاص بالاقتراح كنقول why don't you buy clothes or a new clothes. why don't you اوكي شنو نقصد بها هي لما لا نشتري ملابس. اوكي why don't you إذا هذه حفظوها. why don't you. اوكي إذا هذه نحفظها why don't you، نعقل عليها ونغير الفيرب، نغير الفعل. اوكي هذا هو اللي نبدل. why don't you study. اوكي English. why don't you study English. Why don't you study English? Why? Okay. تبعوا معايا مزيان. Why don't you buy clothes? Why don't you study English? Why don't you watch film? Why don't you watch film? Okay. Why don't you watch film? Why? Okay. Why don't you watch film? Why don't you buy? Why don't you go? Why don't you go? Why don't you go to park? Why don't you go to park? Okay. خصني نحفظ هادو. Why don't you buy clothes? Why don't you study English? Why don't you watch film? Why don't you go to park? Why don't you play football? Why don't you meet your friend? Okay, why don't you meet my best friends? Okay, why don't you? Okay, good. إذن the answer الجواب إلا بغيت نجاوب اش غادي نقول؟ It's a good idea. Okay. It's a good idea. اوكي اذا هذا هو الجواب. It's a good idea. اوكي انها فكرة جيدة. ولا نستعمل let's go, let's buy, let's study, let's watch. اوكي اذا الا سولني شي واحد why don't you buy clothes, let's go. Okay, let's go or let's buy or ممكن نقول it's a good idea. Okay, why don't you buy clothes? Why don't you study? Why don't you watch? Why don't you go to park? Why don't you swim? Okay, in the beach. Okay, or in the sea. Why don't you see? Why don't you why don't you cook? For example, tagine. اوكي لاحظتوا كيفاش ياك